أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We're going to continue our session with check-ins. Today's check-ins are a little bit different, and they're not different because there's fundamentally something different about what I'm asking, but I'm asking for you to reflect on something a little bit different than how you were answering before. So we didn't go into details about this last time. We paused. We wanted, some time to go for people to kind of like let it sink in and so on, right? So this is today. We want to get a little bit deeper into that. We don't need to have an answer for this yet. In fact, like scientifically, they don't necessarily have specific causes that they have narrowed it down to. That this is the cause of depression or something. They've come down to some of them and the interplay between some of them. As some potential causes, but again, like this is not like necessarily like okay, this is exactly why this happened or this. This is in the scientific community. Now, Islamically, and in like Eastern cultures, you might have some slight differences in this, but for our purposes, we're just focusing on just kind of some things that we can pick out as possible reasons by understanding how the human brain works and the mind works and so on. So, with that, just keep these in mind as we explore certain things. So again, just review over here. Notice this keywords over here and like the stuff we're talking about. Notice this, like this stuff that keeps popping up, or kind of focus on these kinds of things as we move forward, because your brain gets primed by certain things that it sees before something else. So with that, go ahead and pick. Now, of course, episode 5 comes before episode 6, which comes before episode 7, but it's not absolutely necessary for us to go in that order. It would be nice to go in that order, but nonetheless, it's up to you. Whatever you have.
Let's start with the one that has no number.
Okay. I was thinking that you're gonna pick that one. And it's good that you picked that one, because I wanted that to be the first one to be picked, and that's why it goes in like a clockwise order. Okay, so with that,
Hey Mom, what are you up to?
Putting up the tree.
We haven't decorated the house yet. I just wanted to make our first Christmas.
I'm gonna go a little bit faster in this, but the idea is just to get like the idea behind it. Okay, and then we're gonna explore the depth of why it happens this way as we go forward, inshallah.
I believe we can be more human if we accept more than one reality. In February 2015, something happened. It had a divisive impact on the world. People said it challenged their objective truth. Time magazine said it changed the course of internet history forever. I like the color of fashion disagreement. But there's something more important about this. We have a really hard time accepting that we experience the physical world differently. Many of you remember the image of this dress. A lot of us see it differently. Some people see it as white and gold. Some people see it as blue and black. I happen to see it as white and gold. Turns out I'm wrong. The color you go buy in the store is actually blue and black. But it's not about the actual color of the dress. That's not what matters. What matters is how our brain perceives the color in this image. People that look at things like demographics, whether that drive these differences. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl, young or old, or what kind of lighting environments you spend time in. And at the core of all of these is that how we experience the world. Your brain is constantly integrating information about your life's experiences, in this case about luminance, shadow, and color, to make probabilistic decisions. And it turns out that we all have slightly different information going into that equation. So I can bias you if I change the context to see this image differently. Hopefully maybe we see it differently now, but I can also take it away. And hopefully now we all see it the same. These kinds of perceptual malleabilities happen all the time. So I'm hoping we can take some time and think about where there's power and opportunity in understanding these differences. I'm going to tell you some stories. Some are personal, some are about art, some are about immersive technologies. But they're all about the power of gaining empathy to each other's experiences. That if we can understand how we can see, hear, and feel the exact same information in the world in entirely different ways, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity and chance to move away from all of the dehumanization that people talk about and rehumanize our interactions and the technologies we use to do this. I've been a violinist since I was 3. I was 9 the first time I heard the world a little differently. I always assumed everyone knew my refrigerator on the D flat to write down the notes of the song. I was like really uncomfortable if Happy Birthday didn't start on a D. I have absolute pitch, not particularly unique in this way. There are plenty of us who have this. We hear sound a lot like many of us see color. But it doesn't mean we hear the world differently. It's not good or bad. It just is. Consequently, I've spent my life as a neurophysiologist, as a technologist, and as a musician, trying to understand these differences in perception and the brain processes that drive them. As scientists, we spend our lives trying to understand and look for the ways we're the most similar. I truly believe that the innovation leaps and interaction leaps we need to make are going to come from understanding the ways we're the most different. For example, so before my mom passed away, she had macular degeneration. She would say something to me like, I can see, but I can't see. So it's kind of a nonsensical statement. What do you do with something like that? Macular degeneration typically involves deterioration of the central part of someone's retina. People with it experience a blind spot in their central vision. I get ocular migraines. The types of migraines I get, a wave of innervation travels through my brain, and my brain area is important for my central vision. When those cells are being innervated by that wave, they can't respond to information in the external world, and I develop a blind spot in my central vision. It looks a lot like this. If you try reading and tracking the yellow dot, you'll see this is a lot like the experience I have. So for 15 minutes a year, when I'm having this type of experience, I see the world as my mom did. In order to see something, I have to look away from it. When she says to me, I can see but I can't see, I get it. I can empathize, and I change. I changed the way I think about innovations to help her life. I spent time building contraptions that magnified what she was looking away from instead of what she was looking at. And I fundamentally think differently about the types of interactions I can have with her to connect. It's this place where a headache and messed up vision that so many we spend our times trying to avoid actually gave me invaluable insight to my mom's world. But it's not always that easy to see both sides. Sometimes we're doing it and we don't even know it. Unfortunately, though, truly knowing what someone is hearing, feeling, or seeing is difficult. It's difficult to know when it's happening, and even when it is, most of us don't even know how to describe it. But there are people who are really good at describing what they see, and it gives us this opportunity to peek into their sensory world in ways we might not even realize. There's a condition called facial dysmorphopsia. So people that have facial dysmorphopsia don't see faces naturally. When they're looking at a face, the features appear to move. So everywhere their gaze is directed, they develop a blind spot, and it fills in with nearby information. This gives the illusion of sort of movement of the faces and sort of contorted and distorted figures. I'm going to show you an example of that. I was only willing to do this to my face. That's why you get to look at me. But if you stare at the little cross on my, follow the yellow crosses, and you'll sort of get an idea of what this experience might look like for someone with this condition. Okay, so you saw that. It also kind of looks like this. Francis Bacon was 20th century painter. Very well known for painting abstract art and portraits that were of contorted, sort of distorted figures. It turns out Francis Bacon had a condition that was likely facial dysmorphopsia. So when he was sharing what we look at as art, in this case, he was actually representing how he truly saw the world. Monet's water lilies. So this is something I noticed when I was looking at this painting that I thought was interesting. So if you stare, I find that when I stare at one of the lilies, and I close one eye, go ahead and do that, the lily seems to pop out more, almost as if it's in 3D. Okay? So I'm not an art historian, art critic, but I am a scientist. And when I see things like this, I had a hypothesis about Monet's vision. There are different pieces of information, ways that cues we take in from the world to be able to know where an object is in space and depth in particular. Some of those cues make use of one eye, we call them monocular. Some of those cues make use of two eyes, and we call them binocular. Cues like color, shading, and occlusion, whether one object's in front of the other, all of those we can get from one eye. But cues that require two eyes, something like relative disparity, which is actually a very important cue, require that both eyes are functioning normally. So I had a hypothesis that Monet actually couldn't make use of the information coming from both eyes. Turns out, Monet had very bad cataracts. And when you started looking around, his cataracts were so bad that when he was painting water lilies, he actually had one of the cataracts removed. And this is a time when we didn't replace, when lenses weren't replaced. So Monet couldn't have made use of the information from two eyes, but the information from one eye was likely very developed at making use of that information. So when you look at this painting now, and you look through one eye, you really are seeing it more like Monet. There's a power to seeing both sides, but we don't always get the clairvoyance of the man of Magritte's painting. But we can accept and understand the power perspective has on perception. So I'm going to show you an example where something as simple as changing your gaze completely changes how you experience the world. I want you all to look up to the right-hand corner, and there's some sunlight in the water, and you should see bubbles that are sort of rising up to the surface. If you're staring at that sunlight, those bubbles probably appear to sort of go up and fly off the screen. Does everyone see that? And they fly off the screen kind of at an angle. Now shift your gaze to where the bubbles are. Okay, so now you probably realize those bubbles are going straight up. You can go back and forth. This experience happens because our brain has trouble resolving conflicting information about local and global motion. The bubbles have a horizontal grating that's moving across them while they're rising vertically. When your gaze is directed at the bubbles, we can separate them and we can experience them both as they are. But when your gaze is directed away, we experience an integration of that information. It's kind of a cool thing. But of course, I like to put a bigger message on it. So there are a few things here. It's the power of perspective. Something as simple as moving my gaze completely changes how I experience what's in front of me. And when my gaze, when my perspective is directed in one place or another, I can't choose to see it differently, even though I've had that experience before. I don't get to. I know it's there, but I can't experience the same way. My perspective determines how I experience it. But I do have the power to choose to know that someone else might be experiencing it that way right now. That is the power of knowing both sides. The human problem is different, and there's a lot of opacity here. We don't always know the state of our biology, and our brains constantly change. Things like hearing loss or changes in our vision, these are happening all the time to our lower sensory processes, but even things like our environments affect our context and affect our sensitivities, whether we grew up in a village in Afghanistan or a town in the Midwest or in a city like New York or Kathmandu with different pressures. Neuroplasticity helps us take the information that's statistically prevalent and relevant in our environments and make use of it so that we change to adapt to our environments. Things like color, shading, contour, all drive this. Cultural language differences and the categorical boundaries we form can cause us to have different experiences at the most basic level of whether we see green or blue. Some are more obvious, some less so. And sometimes we actually get an opportunity to try on each other's sensory experiences. We did this with a pair of arthritis simulation gloves. What we wanted to do here was see if we could take a group of non-designers and give them an empathetic experience of their target user group to work with, and whether it would change how they thought about the problem, how would it change their cognitive approach to the problem. The group with the gloves did change. They thought about simplicity in their design. They thought about space. They got rid of things like drop-down menus, which are completely terrible for anyone with digit mobility issues. They changed how they thought about the problem, and they changed what they thought was important. Immersive technologies like augmented and virtual reality are really starting to try to bridge this gap to empathy. In the case of the arthritis gloves, experience was powerful. It gave them an empathetic experience that was actionable in what they did. But we have to go further. We have to go further than just showing experiences. We have to actually engage sensory experiences in a way that is authentic and natural to how our senses interact in the natural world. So let me give you an example of when I realized how powerful that this was if we did this right. We were developing some new technologies, adult imaging technologies at my company. One of the things we were looking at was the impact of brightness. Just so you realize, a typical display you would have bought 3 years ago was 300 candelas per square meter. The natural moon is about 1 to 2,000 candelas. We were looking at luminances much brighter than that. And we were looking at fire content. So we were watching this fire content and something happened. People reacted. I reacted in ways I hadn't predicted. Just by seeing an image of fire and watching this, my body started to expel heat as if it were real. We could take thermal imaging cameras and measure changes in the temperature on people's faces. The screen wasn't changing, but we were reacting to the content in a way that was natural. In this case, all my brain knew was it had never experienced fire that was that bright and wasn't real. So it did what it does. And just based on the luminance reaching my retina, my knowledge of flame, my body did what it does. If we are going to build experiences, light a bridge, and share and bring empathy to each other's experiences, we have to build immersive technology to bridge this natural sensory experience. So I've been talking a lot about why we should care about empathy and why we need to have empathy. But there's one problem. We don't get empathy unless we make ourselves vulnerable. We don't like to do that. Beethoven lived in fear that people would find out he was going deaf and losing his hearing. We have more and more outlets, which we all use, where we get to curate who we are and what we see about us. But we know from game theory, here's our dilemma, equilibrium, that we end up in a suboptimal state, not as good as we could do if we don't care or vulnerability. So to get to the place where we don't be, we have to empathize with others' vulnerabilities, but we also have to be willing to share our own. So the next time you interact with someone and it doesn't make sense to the way you see the world, it challenges it, maybe they challenge you. Rather than assuming they have the same information to make decisions about the world that you do, assume they don't. Assume it's different. Empathy and experience are powerful, and they give us an opportunity to change. We can change our behaviors. We can change our technologies. We can change our assumptions about why someone might be interacting with us in a way that we don't particularly like. We need to change our perspective. If you could see, hear, or feel someone else's alternate reality today and question your own perceptions, what will you change? Thank you.
was that one? Which one?
Let's just go ahead and go in order. Number 5.
Okay, I'm gonna speed these up. These are crash courses. We restarted them, so we're just kind of continuing the series that was started.
Okay, I'll reset the timer, but it's at we've been 10 minutes now.
Okay, got it.
Famous physician. Let me tell you about Oliver Sacks, a famous physician, professor, and author of unusual neurological case studies. We'll be looking at some of his fascinating research in future lessons, but for now, I just want to talk about Sacks himself. Although he possesses a brilliant and inquisitive mind, Dr. Sacks cannot do a simple thing that your average toddler can. He can't recognize his own face in the mirror. Sacks has a form of prosopagnosia, a neurological disorder that impairs a person's ability to perceive or recognize faces, also known as face blindness. Last week we talked about how brain function is localized, and this is another peculiarly excellent example of that. Sacks can recognize his coffee cup on the shelf, but he can't pick out his oldest friend from a crowd because the specific sliver of his brain responsible for facial recognition is malfunctioning. There's nothing wrong with his vision. The sense is intact. The problem is with his perception, at least when it comes to recognizing faces. Prosopagnosia is a good example of how sensing and perceiving are connected but different. Sensation is the bottom-up process by which our senses like vision, hearing, and smell receive and relay outside stimuli. Perception, on the other hand, is the top-down way that our brains organize and interpret that information and put it into context. So right now, at this very moment, you're probably receiving light from your screen through your eyes, which will send the data of that sensation to your brain. Perception, meanwhile, is your brain telling you that what you're seeing is a diagram explaining the difference between sensation and perception, which is pretty meta. Now, your brain is interpreting that light as a talking person, whom your brain might traditionally recognize as Hank. We are constantly bombarded by stimuli, even though we're only aware of what our own senses can pick up. Like, I can see and hear and feel and even smell this corgi, but I can't hunt using sonar like a bat or hear a mole tunneling underground like an owl or see ultraviolet and infrared light like a mantis shrimp. I probably can't even smell half of what you can smell. No. We have different senses. Yeah, there's a lot to sense in the world, and not everybody needs to sense all the same stuff. So every animal has its limitations, which we can talk about more precisely if we define the absolute threshold of sensation. The minimum stimulation needed to register a particular stimulus 50% of the time. So if I play a tiny little beep in your ear and you tell me that you hear it 50% of the times that I play it, that's your absolute threshold of sensation. We have to use a percentage because sometimes I'll play the beep and you'll hear it, and sometimes you won't, even though it's the exact same volume. Why? Because brains are complicated. Detecting a weak sensory signal like that beep in daily life isn't only about the strength of the stimulus. It's also about your psychological state, your alertness and expectations in the moment. This has to do with signal detection theory, a model for predicting how and when a person will detect a weak stimuli, partly based on context. Exhausted new parents might hear their baby's tiniest whimper, but not even register the bellow of a passing train. Their paranoid parent brains are so trained on their baby, it gives their senses a sort of boosted ability, but only in relation to the subject of their attention. Conversely, if you're experiencing constant stimulation, your senses will adjust in a process called sensory adaptation. Is the reason that I have to check and see if my wallet is there if it's in my right pocket, but if I move it to my left pocket, it feels like a big uncomfortable lump. It's also useful to be able to talk about our ability to detect the difference between two stimuli. I might go out at night and look up at the sky, and well, I know in my objective science brain that no two stars have the exact same brightness. And yeah, I can tell with my eyeballs that some stars are brighter than others, but other stars just look exactly the same to me. I can't tell the difference in their brightness. Are you done? Is it time for you to go? Give me a yes. Okay. Good girl. The point at which one can tell the difference is the difference threshold, but it's not linear. Like, if a tiny star is just a tiny bit brighter than another tiny star, I can tell. But if a big star is that same tiny amount brighter than another big star, I won't be able to tell the difference. This is important enough that we gave the guy who discovered it a law. Weber's law says that we perceive differences on a logarithmic, not linear scale. It's not the amount of change, it's the percentage change that matters. All right, how about now we take a more in-depth look at how one of our most powerful senses works. Vision. Your ability to see your face in the mirror is the result of a long but lightning-quick sequence of events. Light bounces off your face and then off the mirror and then into your eyes, which take in all that varied energy and transforms it into neural messages that your brain processes and organizes into what you actually see, which is your face. Or if you're looking elsewhere, maybe you see a coffee cup or a corgi or a scary clown holding a tiny green pie. So how do we transform light waves into meaningful information? Well, let's start with the light itself. What we humans see as light is only a small fraction of the full spectrum of electromagnetic radiation that ranges from gamma to radio waves. Now, light has all kinds of fascinating characteristics that determine how we sense it, but for the purposes of this topic, we'll understand light as traveling in waves. The wave's wavelength and frequency determines their hue, and their amplitude determines their intensity or brightness. For instance, a short wave has a high frequency. Our eyes register short wavelengths with high frequencies as bluish colors, while we see long, low frequency wavelengths as reddish hues. The way we register the brightness of a color, the contrast between the orange of a sherbet and the orange of a construction cone, has to do with the intensity or amount of energy in a given light wave, which, as we just said, is determined by its amplitude. Greater amplitude means higher intensity means brighter color. Someone just told me that sherbet isn't a word that exists. His name is Michael Aranda, and he's a dumbhead. Did you type it into the dictionary? Type it into Google. Ask Google about sherbet. So sherbet is a thing. So after taking in this light through the cornea and the pupil, it hits the transparent disc behind the pupil, the lens, which focuses the light rays into specific images. And just as you expect the lens to do, it projects these images onto the retina, the inner surface of the eyeball that contains all the receptor cells that begin sensing that visual information. Now, your retinas don't receive a full image like a movie being projected onto a screen. It's more like a bunch of pixel points of light energy that millions of receptors translate into neural impulses and zip back into the brain. These retinal receptors are called rods and cones. Our rods detect grayscale, and they're used in our peripheral vision, as well as to avoid stubbing our toes in twilight conditions when we can't really see in color. Our cones detect fine detail and color. Concentrated near the retina's central focal point called the fovea, cones function only in well-lit conditions, allowing you to appreciate the intricacies of your grandma's china pattern or your uncle's sleeve tattoo. And the human eye is terrific at seeing color. Our difference threshold for colors is so exceptional that the average person can distinguish a million different hues. There's a good deal of ongoing research around exactly how our color vision works, but two theories help explain some of what we One model called the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory suggests that the retina houses 3 specific color receptor cones that register red, green, and blue, and when stimulated together, their combined power allows the eye to register any color. Unless, of course, you're colorblind. About 1 in 50 people have some level of color vision deficiency. They're mostly dudes because the genetic defect is sex-linked. If you can't see the Crash Course logo pop out of you in this figure, it's likely that your red or green cones are missing or malfunctioning, which means that you have dichromatic instead of trichromatic vision and can't distinguish between shades of red and green. The other model for color vision, known as the opponent process theory, suggests that we see color through processes that actually work against each other. So some receptor cells might be stimulated by red, but inhibited by green, while others do the opposite, and those combinations allow us to register color. So back to your eyeballs. When stimulated, the rods and cones trigger chemical changes that spark neural signals, which in turn activate the cells behind them, called bipolar cells, whose job it is to turn on the neighboring ganglion cells. The long axon tails of these ganglions braid together to form the ropey optic nerve, which is what carries the neural impulses from the eyeball to the brain. That visual information then slips through a chain of progressively complex levels as it travels from optic nerve to the thalamus and on to the brain's visual cortex. The visual cortex sits at the back of the brain in the occipital lobe, where the right cortex processes input from the left eye and vice versa. This cortex has specialized nerve cells called feature detectors that respond to specific features like shapes, angles, and movements. In other words, different parts of your visual cortex are responsible for identifying different aspects of things. A person who can't recognize human faces may have no trouble picking out their set of keys from a pile on the counter. That's because the brain's object perception occurs in a different place from space perception. In the case of Dr. Sachs, his condition affects the region of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, which activates in response to seeing faces. Sachs's face blindness is congenital, but it may also be acquired through disease or injury to that same region of the brain. And some cells in a region may respond to just one type of stimulus, like posture or movement or facial expression, while other clusters of cells weave all that separate information together in an instant analysis of the situation. That cloud is frowning and running at me with a tiny cream pie. I'm putting these factors together. Maybe I should get out of here. This ability to process and analyze many separate aspects of the situation at once is called parallel processing. In the case of visual processing, this means that the brain simultaneously works on making sense of form, depth, motion, color. And this is where we enter the whole world of perception, which gets complicated quickly and can even get downright philosophical. So we'll be exploring that in depth next time. But for now, if you were paying attention, you'll learn the difference between sensation and perception, the different thresholds that limit our senses, and some of the neurology and biology and psychology of human vision. Thanks for watching this lesson with your eyeballs, and thanks to our generous co-sponsors who made this episode possible: Alberto Costa, Alton Agrawal, PhD, Frank Zegler, Philip Detmer, and Kurt Skazan. And if you'd like to sponsor an episode and get your own shout out, you can learn about that and other perks available to our Subbable subscribers. Just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. This episode was written by Kathleen Gale, edited by Blake DiDastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwan. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor is Michael Ronda, who is also our sound designer, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so a basic idea of how perception sensations connect or correlate with just like how the brain works and so on. So just understanding that helps a little bit in terms of understanding how people perceive things and how that can impact brain functionality and so on.
Context of psychology. Homunculus. If you heard that word, it probably wasn't in the context of psychology. A monster in Dungeons and Dragons, a song by the Giants, the Bad Guys in Full Metal Alchemist, a novel by James Blaylock. It's Latin for little man, and in psychology, it refers to a kind of sensory map of the human body, a depiction of what we look like if each of our parts grew in proportion to how much we sense with them. Witness. Look at this dude. His ham hands could rip off a car door. I'd be like, if he could lift them, which he couldn't. What we're supposed to look like on the inside? This freaky thing illustrates the weighted significance of our sensory receptors. His disproportional hands are monstrous, for example, because we primarily touch the world with our hands.
Too fast.
Our hands are extremely sensitive.
Too fast?
Yeah, I can't understand him now.
Okay, we'll slow it down. Let me know if this is better.
It wasn't in the context of psychology. A monster in Dungeons and Dragons, a song by the Giants, the Bad Guys in Full Metal Alchemist.
Is that better? Okay.
Novel by James Blaylock. It's Latin for little man, and in psychology, it refers to a kind of sensory map of the human body, a depiction of what we'd look like if each of our parts grew in proportion to how much we sense with them. Witness. Look at this dude. His ham hands could rip off a car door. I'd be like, if he could lift them, which he couldn't. What we're supposed to look like on the inside? This freaky thing illustrates the weighted significance of our sensory receptors. His disproportional hands are monstrous, for example, because we primarily touch the world with our hands, not our elbows, so our hands are extremely sensitive. His mouth, meanwhile, is huge because we also have a ton of sensory receptors in our tongues and lips. It's what we use for tasting food, for second face. As we continue our exploration of how we both sense and perceive the world, the homunculus, while kind of freaky, is actually a pretty attractive model for understanding how our bodies interact with the environment, how we smell it with our outsized nose, taste it with our ridiculous Mick Jagger lips, and touch it with our enormous Donkey Kong hands. So join me as we get to know the hideous little creature within you. Last week, we talked about the difference between sensation and perception. How sensation is the process by which our senses and brain receive information from the outer world, while perception is how we organize and interpret that information and give it meaning. Like right now, my sense of hearing is...
So sensation is how we're the information coming in, and perception is how we organize and structure it in our minds.
Letting me detect sounds while my brain is processing and interpreting them, allowing me to identify and perceive the individual sounds and determine if they're coming from the radio or outside or right behind me. Sound moves in waves that vibrate through a medium like air, and although they function differently than waves of electromagnetic radiation, including what we think of as light, sound waves also can vary in shape. Short waves have a high frequency and a high pitch, like a plucky violin. Long waves have a low frequency and pitch, like a mournful cello. Wave height or amplitude determine a sound's loudness, which we typically measure in decibels. And just as light waves become electrical impulses that we register with our sight, so too do our ears turn vibrating air into signals that our brains can decipher. While the human ear might not be as elegant as the jackrabbits or as wild as the long-eared bats, it's actually a pretty incredible organ. Or organs, since we have two of them, which helps give us directional stereophonic hearing. That's the 3D type of hearing that we couldn't experience if we had just one big freaky ear in the middle of our foreheads. Your outer ear, the part that you can see, pierce, tug on, collects sound waves and funnels them through the ear canal into the middle ear, where they cause your eardrum to vibrate. From there, sound vibrations are amplified by the so-called ossicle bones, which also happen to be the most awesomely named bones in your body: the stirrup, the hammer, and the anvil. From here, those physical vibrations travel to the inner ear, where they bump into the snail-shaped cochlea, and its surrounding fluids get jostled around, causing some of your 16,000 tiny cochlear hair cells to bend. This motion triggers neighboring nerve cells that convert that physical energy into electrical impulses, zipping up the auditory nerve into the auditory cortex, where the brain is like, oh, songbirds, or Elvis, or vengeance, or whatever. And you know what goes great with a little bit of rockabilly or revenge? A nice meal. One of the greatest joys in life is enjoying flavors. Whether you prefer casserole or caviar, we all get our tasting done in the same way, starting with our taste buds. Each of our thousands of taste buds contains a sort of pocket-like pore that contains 50 to 100 hair-like taste receptor cells that read food molecules and report back to the brain. That chip is salty. That lemon is sour. Everybody used to think that our tongues just detected 4 distinct tastes: sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. And you've probably seen a version of this bogus taste map which incorrectly assigns certain tastes to certain parts of your tongue. But we now recognize a 5th flavor, the savory, meaty MSGE taste, for which there is no English word. It's known as umami. But taste is nothing without smell. Plug your nose in a bite of cold bacon is just a mouthful of salt. This is a prime example of sensory interaction. The principle that one sense can influence the other. I'll get back to smell in just a bit, but I want to take a moment to talk about what happens when those sensory interactions get messy. Let's take a little question here, shall we? Do certain words trigger a strong specific taste in your mouth? Like, does the word kitten taste like candy canes? Has hearing a sound ever made you see a color? Like, does Prince's voice singing Purple Rain actually cause the color purple to flash before your eyes? Do you ever feel like you're being touched when you smell something? Like, does the smell of lilies give you the sensation of touching a cold metal surface? Most of you said no to all of those questions, which is what makes you feel dizzy, salty, sour, and bitter. And you've probably seen a sensory interaction. The principle, talk about what happens when those sensory interactions get messy. Let's take a little question here, shall we? Do certain words trigger a strong specific taste in your mouth? Like, does the word kitten taste like candy canes? Has hearing a sound ever made you see a color? Like, does Prince's voice singing Purple Rain actually cause the color purple to flash before your eyes? Do you ever feel like you're being touched when you smell something? Like, does the smell of lilies give you the sensation of touching a cold metal surface? Most of you said no to all of those questions, but at least one of you out there answered yes. And more likely than not, that person has synesthesia, a rare and fascinating neurological condition where 2 or more senses get wrapped together. This kind of sensory mix-up is involuntary, and it's experienced without forethought in a durable and consistent way. Like, the number 7 is always going to taste like coffee, and it's never going to switch to tomato juice. And we're still not sure what causes this phenomenon. One idea suggests that the rogue development of new neural connections may override normal boundaries that typically separate the senses. Another theory suggests that all babies are born with synesthesia and experience mixed senses until the brain matures and creates separate sense channels, unless they don't, in which case you grow up to be a synesthete. Yet another theory links the condition to wonky neurochemistry, in which the neurotransmitters associated with one function turn up way over in a different part of the brain. Just another example of how the mind is still extremely mysterious. So back to the comparatively boring topic of smells that only smell. Unlike our wave-detecting senses of sight and hearing, our taste and smell are chemical senses. We differentiate the smells of spring lilacs, grilled cheese, and gasoline when airborne molecules travel up the nose and reach the 5 to 10 million receptor cells at the top of each nasal cavity. And yes, that means when you smell poop, there's poop particles in your nose. These receptors send information to the brain's olfactory bulb, then zips it onto the primary smell cortex and parts of the limbic system responsible for emotion and memory. Unlike our 5 different taste receptors or 2 types of retinal receptors, we don't have specifically differentiated smell receptors. Rather, odor receptors can come together in different combinations. So just like pressing different keys on your keyboard can allow you to form tons of different words, so too can these distinct combinations of activated smell receptors communicate some 10,000 unique smells. But how we feel about a smell and our perception of it is often tangled up in our experiences with that scent. If a beloved grandma baked gingerbread every time we visited, those memories may make you partial to the smell of gingerbread. Even if we can't immediately name the odor, our brains are amazing at storing and recognizing old scents by their associations, which is why you may suddenly...
Notice the word associations.
feel happy when you walk into a bakery even before you realize you're thinking of your grandma. The emotional power of smell partly has to do with how our sense circuitry connects to the brain's limbic system, right next to our emotional registry, the amygdala, and our memory keeper, the hippocampus. That's why sense can be so intimately tied with our feelings and memories, and how a whiff of Nag Champa can immediately transport you back to eating chips in your freshman dorm room. Smelling, hearing, tasting, seeing, all fantastic, but if there's one thing that popular music has taught us, besides a bunch of really terrible relationship advice, it's that when it comes to our senses, we're all about touching. We got songs about magic touches and golden touches, invisible and human touches, songs about touching ourselves, touching me, touching you, and even what you can't touch. Touch is extremely important, especially during early development. Baby monkeys that are allowed to see, hear, and smell but not touch their mamas become extremely distraught. That's just a neat experiment. Premature human babies gain weight faster if they're held and massaged, and some studies indicate that children who didn't receive enough physical attention as infants are at higher risk for emotional, behavioral, and social problems as they grow. Your sense of touch is actually a combination of 4 distinct skin sensations: pressure, warmth, cold, and pain. If you touch various spots of your skin with something soft like this anglerfish, you'll feel that you sense different amounts of softness on different parts of your body. Just put that up there. The same goes for a warm mug or an ice cube or a needle point. You'll sense that some spots are more or less sensitive to each of the 4 distinct sensations. Other skin sensations like tickles, itches, and the experience of wetness are just variations on those 4 basic sensations. Ultimately, your sense of touch joins forces with sensors in your bones, joints, and tendons to provide your personal kinesthesis, the way that your body senses its own movement and positioning. You use your kinesthetic sense whenever you walk, dance, swim, or hula hoop. It's what the cops are testing drunk people for when they ask them to touch their noses with their eyes closed. This sense allows you to detect changes in the position of your body without relying on other senses, which is why you can still cha-cha, backstroke, and hula hoop with your eyes closed and your ears plugged. The partner sense to your kinesthesis is your vestibular sense, which monitors your head's position and your balance. This sense of equilibrium is ruled by the pretzel-shaped semicircular canals and fluid-filled vestibular sacs that connect those canals to the cochlea in your inner ear. So, if you spin around a bunch and then suddenly stop, it'll take a minute for that inner ear fluid to return to normal, which is what makes you feel dizzy. That moving fluid is actually fooling your brain into thinking your body is still spinning. It's a good example of how even our normal functioning senses can fool us. Understanding exactly how we get fooled helps us understand how our perceptual system works, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about next time. For now, hopefully you realize that your homunculus is actually kind of beautiful in its own way, because you learned how your sense of hearing, taste, smell, and touch work. And thanks for watching, especially to all of our subbable subscribers who make this whole channel possible. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Crash Course Psychology, get a copy of one of our Rorschach prints, and even be animated into an upcoming episode, just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. My captain, edited by Blake and myself, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins.
What was the time?
That was a total of 25 minutes.
So let's go ahead and finish this. And then the next one is episode 7. Now this is continuing on, but now it's actually going into perceptions and so on. So
Holiday story time!
now this topic is the most important topic, but we needed to understand a little bit of how things work in terms of the brain, in terms of how the brain works, so that we can understand how this works. Okay, so this is just that, and it's going to give us understanding of how to move forward, essentially.
Every rose has its thorn. Only the good die young, slow and steady wins the race, and what you see is what you get. Except that in reality, several varieties of roses do not have thorns. Both the good and the bad on occasion tragically die young. Fast and steady beats slow and steady every time, and what you see is, well, our perception, or how we order the cacophonous chaos of our environment, is heavily influenced, biased even, by our expectations, experiences, moods, and even cultural norms. And we can be pretty good at fooling ourselves. In the last 2 lessons, we've learned how we see shapes and colors, hear sounds, and smell and taste the world's chemical concoctions. But our senses mean little without our brain's ability to organize and translate that data into meaningful perceptions. Without perception, your mother's face is just a combination of shapes. Without the ability to interpret scent, we couldn't differentiate the smell of toast from a grease fire. Our perception is the process that allows us to make meaning out of our senses and experience the world around us. It's what makes life understandable, but also it means that sometimes what you see is not actually what you get. So that was awesome, right? Upside down, I look like me. Right side up, I look like some kind of terrifying monster. Your brain isn't used to upside down faces, so it's basically just doing its best to put the pieces together. But it knows exactly what a right side up face should look like, and that is not it. Just one of thousands of examples proving that your brain does all the work of perception, and your eyes really are just feeding raw data. It's important data, but it isn't actually what we see. What we see is the realm of the mind, not the eye. What kind of bird do you see right now? A duck, right? But if I said, what kind of mammal do you see? A bunny probably would have popped out at you. Now, you should be seeing both of them popping back and forth. But likely your brain wants to perceive the image related to whichever cue you first heard, or whichever image is more familiar to you. By cueing mammal or bird, I influenced your expectations, and you saw what I wanted you to see. Pretty cool. Your expectations are just one factor in your perceptual set, the psychological factors that determine how you perceive your environment. Sometimes seeing is believing, but perceptual set theory teaches us that believing is also seeing. Context is another factor in your perceptual set. If the duck bunny thing was pictured with Easter eggs all around it, you think bunny right away, which is kind of weird considering that of ducks and bunnies, one is actually much more likely to be near an egg. It's not the bunny. And that's an example of how culture is also an important part of our perceptual set. As much as our perceptions are affected by context and expectations, they're also swayed by our emotions and motivations. People will say a hill is more steep if they're listening to emo by themselves than if they're listening to power pop and walking with a friend. Most of the time, your personal perceptual set leads you to reasonable conclusions, but sets can also be misleading or even harmful. They're the basis of tons of entertaining optical illusions. These two tables, for example, are the same size, but the positions of their legs make that impossible for you to believe until I lay them over each other. And while the fooling of our visual perception can be fun, it also helps us understand how it works. Our minds are given a tremendous amount of information, especially through the eyes, and we need to make quick work of it. Turning marks on a paper into words, slobby lumps into the face of a friend, seeing depth, color, movement, and contrast, being able to pick out an object from all the other clutter around it seems so simple, but we've come to discover that it is quite complicated. So complicated that we have a name for it: form perception. Take a neat little dynamic called the figure-ground relationship. It's how we organize and simplify whatever scene we're looking at into the main objects or figures and the surroundings or ground that they stand out against. The classic faces or faces illusion is an example. Is it two faces against a white background or a face against a black background? If you look long enough, you'll see that the relationship between the object and its surroundings flip back and forth, continually reversing. Sometimes white is the figure and black is the ground. That figure-ground dynamic, though, is always there. The concept applies to non-visual fields as well. Say you're at a party holding up the wall and creeping on your crush across the room, trying to casually listen in on what they're saying. As the focus of your attention, that voice becomes the figure, while all the other voices jabbering about sports and beer pong and Sherlock and everything that doesn't have to do with that one beautiful person all becomes the ground. And now that your mind has distinguished figure from ground, it has to perceive that form as something meaningful. Like, for one, that large shape on the couch is a person, and further, that person isn't just any person, but the specific unique person of your dreams. One way our minds shuffle all of these stimuli into something coherent is by following rules of grouping, like organizing things by proximity, continuity, or closure. The rule of proximity, for instance, simply states that we like to group nearby figures together. So instead of seeing a random garble of partygoers, we tend to mentally connect people standing next to each other. Like, there's the hockey team over there, and the debate team over there, and then you got the band geeks. Why are all these people at the same party? We're also drawn to organize our world with attention to continuity, perceiving smooth, continuous patterns and often ignoring broken ones. We also like closure, and not just after a breakup. Visually, we want to fill in gaps, to create whole objects. So here, we see an illusory triangle breaking the completion of these circles on the left, but just add the little lines, close up the circles, and you stop seeing the triangle. Form perception is obviously crucial to making sense of the world, or, a moderately interesting party. But imagine trying to navigate the world without depth perception. As you gaze upon your one true love, the image hits your retina in 2 dimensions, yet somehow you're still able to see the full 3-dimensional gloriousness of their form. You can thank your depth perception for that. Depth perception is what helps us estimate an object's distance and full shape, in this case, a nice shape that is currently too far away from you. It is at least partially innate, even most babies have it. We're able to perceive depth by using both binocular and monocular visual cues. Binocular cues, as the name gives away, require the use of both eyes. Because your eyes are about 2.5 inches apart, your retinas receive ever so slightly different images. Camera 1, camera 2. So when you look at it with both your eyes, your brain compares the 2 images to help judge distance. The closer the object, the greater the difference between the 2 images, also known as the retinal disparity. Retinal disparity is pretty easy to see. You just hold your fingers up and then you look past them and suddenly you have 4 instead of 2 fingers. Because those left and right images vary only slightly, retinal disparity doesn't help much when it comes to judging far off distances. For that, we look to monocular cues to help us determine the scale and distance of an object. These are things like relative size and height, linear perspective, texture gradient, and interposition. Relative size allows you to determine that your crush is not supporting a tiny newborn chihuahua on their shoulder, but rather there's a full-grown chihuahua behind them in the back of the room. In the absence of a chihuahua or leg object, you can also judge distances using your linear perspective. If you've ever made a perspective drawing in art class, you'll remember that parallel lines appear to meet as they move into the distance, just like the tiled floor. The sharper the angle of convergence and the closer the lines together, the greater the distance will seem. And if you've ever looked out at a mountain range or a Bob Ross painting, you'll understand texture gradient as the cue that makes the first ridge appear all rocky and textured, but as your eye follows the ridges into the distance, they become less detailed. And finally, our interposition or overlap cue tells us when one object, like this oaf here, blocks our view of something else, your crush, we perceive it as being closer, and in this case, especially annoying. So all these perceptual concepts can be demonstrated with a fixed image, but of course, life involves a lot of movement, at least if you're doing it right. We use motion perception to infer speed and direction of a moving object, like your brain gauges motion based partly on the idea that shrinking objects are retreating and enlarging objects are approaching. The thing is, your brain is easily tricked when it comes to motion. For instance, large objects appear to move much more slowly than small ones going the same speed. And in addition to organizing things by form, depth, and motion, our perception of the world also requires consistency, or as psychologists call it, constancy. Perceptual constancy is what allows us to continue to recognize an object regardless of its distance, viewing angle, motion, or illumination, even as it might appear to change color, size, shape, and brightness depending on the conditions. Like, we know what a chihuahua looks like, whether it looks like this, or this. In the end, though, your perception isn't just about funky optical illusions, it's about how you understand the world and your place in it, both physically and psychologically. Your sensory organs pull in the world's raw data, which is disassembled into little bits of information, and then reassembled in your brain to form your own model of the world. It's like your senses are just collecting a bunch of Legos, and your brain can build and rebuild whatever it perceives. A party, your crush, a duck, or a chihuahua. In other words, your brain constructs your perception.
So this is the ultimate concept over here. Your brain is constructing your perception, as in there are certain things that your brain is doing automatically that facilitate your perception. But at the same time, when it comes to what information that you have in your mind in terms of rules and things like that you've set for yourself or that you've understood as boundaries and so on. That's also when you've helped your brain make certain perceptions. So for example, you might assume that something is not possible, and so when things, because you have this assumption, your brain is going to process whatever information is taken in with that rule in place, with that maxim in place. And so you're going to pretty much box yourself in a cage that might not have needed to be there, right? In other words, this is what they talk about when you want to think outside the box. When they talk about the concept of groupthink, when you have a group that you're working with and everyone's sort of thinking the same way, then you need a fresh outside perspective because everyone might be thinking the same way, right? And if you get somebody outside to come in and kind of give you a third perspective, then, or second perspective in this case, then in that case, you're going to be able to look at a problem or a situation in more than just one way. And this is useful when it comes to coming up with unique solutions to problems that are sort of recurring and we're not able to get out of them. So one thing that we can do is to make sure that the boundaries that we've actually set for ourselves are actually boundaries that need to be set. And this is where aligning our lowercase t truths to actual capital T truths is very useful. A lot of times we've sort of set our own lowercase t truths and then kind of use them as rules to determine how we need to interpret the information that's coming in from our senses. And so our brain uses them to construct our perceptions or things, whatever, that come associated with that. So it's important to understand how the brain works automatically, right, just by default, but at the same time, understanding how different things that we kind of prime it with might have an impact in terms of what we actually end up seeing or we don't end up seeing. So you might have had a certain experience, and right after that, somebody asks you a question about something, and maybe in this case, it happened, one of the possibilities that might have been in that particular scenario, whatever the person asked, maybe one of the things related to what your situation looked like just moments before. So you're going to be already primed with that, and so you're only going to focus on that aspect of it. And so everything else that was irrelevant from that perspective, you're not going to be really thinking about. You might not catch it. And so that's something that can impact how you understand certain things. So I had a situation, for example, when I was working with one of the cases, and I mentioned that the Gottman Institute, from John and Julie Gottman, doctors John and Julie Gottman, they have this, they have the Gottman Institute, and they mentioned something. I don't remember the exact number that they mentioned, but I think it was about 90-something% of success rate for people that were going through, they were on the verge of divorce. They just figured that this is it, there's no coming back. There was like pretty much a lot of stuff that was making them convinced that they're not going to be able to work things out, and they were pretty much on their last, pretty much they had, I guess, even gone through their last straw, and they decided, you know what, let's give it a try. What are we going to lose? We're already getting divorced or whatever and stuff, so let's see if if anything changes or not. Like, we're not going to actually lose anything because we've already gotten to the point of divorce or separation or whatever the situation was, depending on what the state of what was the status between the couple. So they went to these courses, these workshops, and so on. And it seemed that, I believe it was like 90-something% of people that were going through some sort of difficulty, they were able to walk out of it and sort of fix those and kind of get back together if they were breaking apart. So in other words, I was mentioning over here, the non-Muslims had this kind of success rate, and Islam would have more of a success rate, right? So it's just a matter of whether we can actually improve what it is that, it's a matter of what we believe we can make it, there things can improve, or if we don't think that things can improve. So when it comes to this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages, for example, the husband, and I'm mentioning this because I want to mention like the case that I was talking about. But anyways, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages the man, the husband, that if he sees anything that he doesn't like in his wife, there might be something good that comes out of it, and nonetheless, and so he shouldn't be hasty and kind of like divorce her. And on the other hand, a wife, if she doesn't find something that she would like from her husband, there might be something that she's getting out of it, and it's that she can have like a compromise or discussion or whatever and stuff, so they can kind of come up with something. Because then the husband, if she says that, okay, well, like, if I get this, then I'm willing to sort of like give up this, and it might be something that she doesn't really want anyways and stuff, so she might kind of like do that. But at the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in this ayah that that the reconciliation is better. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does allow divorce, but at the same time He's saying that islah is better, reconciliation is better, because it is a possibility. And if you really want it, it is possible, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also mentions that when it comes to if two parties are having some sort of difficulty, and some sort of conflict, then they can set up arbitrators from their sides. So the man has an arbitrator, the husband has an arbitrator put up from his side, and the wife has an arbitrator put up from her side, and then they can arbitrate and go from there. And the ayah says in this context, in yurida islahan, if both of them want islah, reconciliation, yuwaffiq lahu bainahum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to make that, in summary, so he's going to make it successful, as in he's going to make it possible, and he's going to make it work out, essentially. And so I mentioned this because in the other context, or in the context I was talking about, I mentioned this concept right here, and I mentioned that the non-Muslims had 90-something% of the Gottman Institute. They mentioned about, I think, 90-something% that if I remember correctly, percent success rate. And so with that in mind, if we understand that this is possible like that, so I mentioned this, and the person misunderstood this or misremembered this because they were thinking about something else, I guess, or maybe they had something else in their mind. So the information that they actually took out of this, and they conveyed it to somebody else later on, and then that person sort of mentioned it to me, and I was like, okay, that's not what I was talking to the person, right? And they said that the person mentioned that I had said that despite like some sort of training and progress or whatever and stuff, that 90% of the people actually did not make it work out. And these are people, they said that this person, or that I said that people followed the strategies, they ended up working out together, I mean they ended up doing good together, but then after that 90% of them actually fell apart. Now I would never say something like that in the context of trying to get islah done, right? And I was actually mentioning what I just mentioned, about how it's actually successful for non-Muslims. And so I mentioned that it's even more likely, the percentage would even be higher. In fact, it would be 100% if both sides wanted it and they understood the grand scheme of things, as in they understood what's really relevant and important in marriages and kind of took that and moved forward. And with that in mind, this person misunderstood this, and I guess this person was thinking that they did not want islah, they just wanted to get out of this marriage because they just wanted to do their own, they just wanted to try something different or something like that. Or maybe they were just confused, or maybe they didn't, overwhelmed, or whatever the situation was. I don't want to get into too many details, but nonetheless, in this particular situation, I believe it was a matter of a person personalizing things, and they felt themselves as incapable of being successful. Essentially, they didn't value themselves. They had a really, really low self-image, and so they were really running away from their problems, and they felt like they needed to go with somebody else because this person, the person that they were with, might have realized how unworthy, or not unworthy, but how this person had nothing to go on for them, right? There's nothing going on. This person may not have had a college degree or a job or whatever and stuff, right? And so they felt like the other person, this is a female, which is why it's relevant in this case that I mentioned this aspect of, because it's not her responsibility Islamically to provide for the family, right? And so she still had this concern that this is how things are for her, and so she had a really low self-image. She really didn't think that she was a successful person or whatever, and as a consequence, she started feeling like everything that was said was actually aimed at her as a human being, as a person, as opposed to the action, and as opposed to it being sort of just some suggestions of optimization in terms of her strategies or whatever she was doing, right? So instead of looking at it as somebody sort of supporting her and kind of giving her new ways to kind of grow and develop and stuff like that, she considered everything that was said as personal attacks in a negative way, or personal attacks. So with that, when this person was speaking to me, they actually misheard what I was saying just because they focused on something and they were thinking about something, and sort of misheard what I was saying, even though the context was I was giving as much detail as possible to emphasize the point of Islah and the benefits of it, and I was giving all the things that I could think of, or that were relevant in that context that would be useful. So nonetheless, the person still took it in this way, something exact opposite of what I was actually trying to say. They heard that, or at least they heard something, but then their brains processed it a certain way. And so they were looking for ways to kind of get out of this situation. So they misheard what I was saying. I don't want to say misheard. They heard what I was saying, but they not misremembered, but they misinterpreted it, I guess, in the context. So they might have heard it, but then they thought I had said something different because there was some like mental rules or axioms or like certain like kind of sort of what's the word? Some things that kind of priming their thoughts, and so they took the information, they missed like I guess they sort of tried to connect it, try to like make sense of it. So they repackaged the information that came in, the sensory input that came in. They repackaged it based on whatever rules that they were going by, and then the memory that they had stored with it was something that was not actually what happened in reality. And so perceptions, your whatever it's in your mind, whatever you're being primed with and stuff, whatever your state of emotion is and so on, can actually have this kind of impact in terms of what you actually end up remembering, and then therefore what you end up actually doing. So a person who has paranoia might actually read the situation in a negative way. Their input might come in the right way, but then how they sort of like package the information into and store it into memory, that might actually come in a completely different way than what actually ended up happening. And so when we talk about lowercase t truths, that's one of the things that I'm really trying to get at over here. People might not actually read the same situation that you were in and they were in the same way as you're reading it, right? Because of how these things in their minds are happening. So I hope this is making sense, that your brain constructs your perceptions in the sense that you're the actual physical brain, but also your mind in terms of whatever rules and like boundaries and stuff like that you have in mind, also prime what the way your brain actually packages those memories and things like that, and whatever perceptions that build up upon that. And so just something to keep in mind over here.
And if you were correctly constructing your perceptions this lesson, you learned what forms your perceptual set, how form perception works, and the many visual cues that influence your depth perception. Thank you for watching, especially to all of our subbable subscribers who make this whole channel possible. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Crash Course Psychology, get a copy of one of our Rorschach prints, and even be animated into an upcoming episode, just go to subbable.com/Crash Course. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blakely Bestino and myself, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director...
So over here, they actually focus more on like the physical working, but I was also getting into, I was applying this as well into how our minds come in, and I think next time they're going to be talking about our conscience. Yeah, the next time is conscience, so we'll talk about that another time, inshallah. But in the meantime, I hope this gave us some sort of perspective on how these things can start developing and kind of impact people. So if a person feels like things are not going a certain way and they feel like everything is out to get them, then what happens at the end of the day is that they end up reading the situation in that way. Reading meaning the sensory input that comes in, but then like the way it's packaged is impacted by that, by whatever they think is happening. So a person might have for example, I've had multiple cases that they had breakups. Remember that we did a case study on that. And so in that case, a person is perceiving that the other person just wants to harm them, they want to hurt them and so on. And then they want, like this person, the victim, or the perceived victim, is thinking that they need to go, like somebody needs to go and like avenge them and like get justice for them and so on, and like hurt the other person in equal measures and so on. But ultimately what might actually be happening is that the person sort of let this person do whatever it is that they did, in the sense that whatever the person does, they actually took it that way as a negative thing, right? So a person might say, okay, we just need to like we're done, we can't move forward and stuff. So another person, the person who's considering themselves as the victim here, may, and again, this is not applying to all cases, but I'm giving examples as one possibility, that the other person might feel that as like this person just wants to hurt me, because they end up like breaking down, and they go into depression and so on, and they feel like the other person is the one that actually caused their depression. But a lot of these are like, when I say the depression, this includes acute depression and so on, or like specific things that are initiated or triggered by specific events in their life and so on. But so in this case, this person might find themselves crying a lot and stuff and all this, and they're blaming the other person for this, right? But in reality, they are the ones who couldn't actually find closure to this. They are the ones that had these rules that like life is supposed to go a certain way, and that when it didn't go that way, then somehow or another the other person sort of like warped reality or something like that, right? But in reality, the person themselves had like their small t truths did not actually align with capital T truths of reality, how life actually works and what we need to understand. So as I kind of go into this a little bit more later on, inshallah, as I do this, I want you to think about one thing, and this is something that I've sort of found very useful, and that is that when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, what we want to do is that every encounter that we have, any experience that we have, even if it doesn't go, according to our plans, or if it does go according to our plans, if we really believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually mapping out things for us, right? And we understand that our role, our job is only doing our part, which is just to plan and do, like, take steps. It is not to guarantee a particular end result. Our job is just to make sure that we are doing, we're taking our steps, we're taking our actions and stuff, all that, and we have a plan in place. And as we're navigating this, as we move forward, we might realize that a portion of our plan didn't go through exactly how we envisioned it. However, because we trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we're actually doing things to align ourselves according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's system, then what we do is when we get to that part of the plan that didn't go as we thought, we adjust everything thereafter to match with this new state of existence that we're in now. What I mean by that is, now because the plan didn't go this way, but it ended up going this other way. So in this other way, at the end of that road, we're going to be like, okay, moving forward, let me kind of adjust my original plan to match with this situation that I'm in, or this new thing that I'm in that I didn't have accounted for in my original plan. Okay. And it doesn't mean that you can't have certain things that you strive for that are actually encouraged Islamically, but it does mean that you cannot, or you should not, align yourselves to focus on things that may not be actually possible, right? So for example, you might want to believe that, let's say that you can I don't know, I'm trying to think of some things that from a scientific perspective may not seem possible at the moment, but I'm having difficulty because from an Islamic perspective, pretty much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can do like whatever, right? But let's say that somebody wants to become Abraham Lincoln. Let's say that, right? Let's say that person wants to become Abraham Lincoln, and they want to like emulate him 100% in every way of his existence and so on. And so they keep trying and trying and trying, and every time something happens, something is different, and but they still think that they're going to become Abraham Lincoln in the same way that he was, and so on, in his context, right? So let's say a person keeps on doing that, but the reality keeps on sort of like getting him away from that. So in this case, this is the person who's going to not be able to get to their stuff, right? So rather, what it is Islamically sort of allowable, let's say, or encouraged in Islam, is to do things sort of like for the greater good of people, right? And to help look out for people and so on. So let's say that that's your ultimate vision. Then in that case, the details of that may actually be adjusted according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best for you, right? But it doesn't mean that your way of doing things is going to necessarily be the best way of doing things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not necessarily going to like force you into being in that situation. So you might hurt yourself, you might kind of like get into a situation where it might actually be harmful to you, but you don't know that future. But ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does know that future, and so he's going to steer you away from it. So when you let go of that kind of control, the control that does not belong to you, right? Then in that case, you're going to find yourself becoming more content with life, and you're going to become more happy in terms of your affairs and the resolution of your affairs and so on. So that's something to keep in mind. And the Prophet had mentioned that the best kind of ghina, like the best kind of richness, is ghina nafs, the richness of the self. So here, what is considered, for me, what I consider as something like something that went well, I consider that as whatever it is that ends up happening, so long as I try my best. And if I have a plan in place and I tried my best, then ultimately whatever ends up happening, it's something that went well, because that is me aligning my lowercase t truth with capital T truth. In other words, I'm looking at the situation as well relative to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made happen. Not necessarily aligned with what I had originally thought was the way it's supposed to happen. So in other words, I define what like something going well with the rubric of reality, or the capital T truth, instead of my lowercase t truth rubric. So the rubrics, whatever it is, your standard that you're measuring against, needs to be adjusted. So if your rubric is what reality looks like, then you're going to find things working out amazing all the time. Even if things seem to be bad for other people, for you they're always going to be good, because that's how reality works. But on the other hand, if you aim, or if you sort of fixate on your individual rubric, then every person has a different rubric that's relative to whatever experiences and understandings that they have in life, right? Unless they let go of those rubrics and they align themselves with the capital T truth rubric, which is the reality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designed for us. So with this in mind, nothing is going to bother you anymore after this, except what is not good from that Islamic perspective, with a reality-based perspective. And just something to keep in mind over here. And so one of the things that I find useful is that when it comes to any experience that you're in, when you finish that experience, whatever it is, whether it's eating a meal, whether it's hanging out with your friends or family or whatever, or whether it's like, for example, taking a nap or whatever, that experience, when it finishes, at the end of that experience, meaning the last bite that you take and then you finish it and you're done, right? You said Alhamdulillah, because this is the closure of this event. And throughout this event, you were very mindful, meaning you enjoyed the experience as you were going through it, and that's it. You didn't go beyond that. You didn't like think about like my life, or like you weren't thinking about the future in terms of like, okay, well, what is the next meal I'm going to get and so on. You actually went through the experience itself during the moment itself, or during the experience itself. And when it finished, when it came to the like conclusion, you stopped, you said Alhamdulillah, and then you move forward, and that's it. So you had closure in every event, every moment in your life. You find closure, so that you're completely always satisfied. And that's it. So if something didn't happen according to the way that you expected or you wanted and stuff, no problem, because that expectation is that, or I mean, in this case, sorry, not expectation, but like what you did is that you lived the experience and you accepted that whatever you were planning may not have been the best thing, and what like at that moment, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put something else in its place that was going to be better for that context itself. And yeah, so if it's something that you're trying to help, as a project in a masjid and stuff, maybe it wasn't like something that you were going to do, maybe it wasn't relevant or best at that time, or maybe there was something missing or something like that that you didn't realize at that moment. But then as you move forward, there's going to be another time and place for that, and so you can try that out then, right? But if something else happens again that time and you keep trying, then in that case you just understand that those are not the right places or times or contexts or whatever it might be. So with this in mind, when you close any situation like this halaqah right here, I mean, sorry, this I guess webinar, when you do this, then at the end of this, you're not looking forward to the next one in the sense that, like you're like while you're going through this, you're not thinking about the next one. You're just focusing on where you're at right now. You're just focusing on this particular time slot, and that's it. And the next time when that comes in, you're grateful for another opportunity, right? But you didn't actually expect that you're going to be granted this other opportunity on Thursday, for example, right? So that's why the scholars will say, for example, if Allah gives us life, then we're going to continue next time at a certain time or whatever. So in this context, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us life and He gives us another opportunity to have this session on Thursday, then we're going to have that there, inshallah. So when it happens, we're grateful for another opportunity, but we didn't expect that. We may or may not get it or something like that. We just finished this session. We have a plan in place for Thursday, and we're going to keep working towards getting that the slides and everything ready for that day. But then whether or not it happens, that's with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that's not something that I'm going to hope for. Like, I'm not expecting that, right? I'm not saying like, okay, it must happen, otherwise everything's going to fall apart and stuff. No, I'm just saying, okay, well, I'm going to do my part. If it does happen or doesn't happen, that's in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's control, and that's not in my control. So I don't need to get worked up about something that I don't have control over. And this is the concept of locus of control, and that's an important key phrase, I guess, that we're going to look into next time, inshallah. And if we feel like our locus of control is a certain, it's like, if we feel that we have control in certain situations that we in reality don't have control over, then in that case we become depressed. I don't want to use depressed like lightly. We become stressed out, let's say, and eventually it can lead to certain types of depressions. And that is something that I want to really address over here. So locus of control is very important. Sometimes we feel like we have certain freedoms when in reality we don't have those freedoms. So our perceptions can have really big impact in terms of how we end up hurting ourselves or helping ourselves and so on. Sometimes we feel like there are certain definitions of certain words that may not actually have consensus behind them. So for example, the word education, there is no consensus. If you look at the philosophy of education, you can look at many different philosophers of education, like Horace Mann was one of them, John Dewey was another one, and several others. They were kind of looking into what is education, what's the definition of education, what's the purpose of education, what's the function and role of education, and what's the format and structure of education, and so on. And so there isn't a consensus behind that. There's something that people are running with, and that's what we see. but then it's always being optimized because people are still kind of investigating new things. They're trying to look at different things, different perspectives, and so on. So things are going to be constantly changing. But when we assume that everything is very, very fixed, it's specific, a certain way, and then we sort of align ourselves with that, thinking that this is reality, we are the ones that end up taking ahead. It doesn't mean that we can't find benefit in structured curricula and so on, but it does mean that we need to be aware of the limitations thereof. And so with that in mind, I hope this helps in giving a little bit of depth about what happens in these kinds of situations and how then we can reshape sort of our perceptions, our understandings, our rules that we go by, the boxes that we sort of cage ourselves in by putting these arbitrary boundaries relative to the actual reality. So next time we'll continue, inshallah. In the meantime, you guys could continue exploring this, looking at like your experiences, your interactions that you've had with people, and what has led them to be in a certain situation, what similarities to what we talked about you're finding with them, and so that's something that you guys can continue doing, inshallah, with that question. And as we continue going into deeper stuff, then you'll be able to inshallah identify some of those things, inshallah, at least anecdotally. I'm not saying that this is going to be scientifically proven, because that needs a lot more research and probably a lot more years of research and discussion among the among those that are going into this kind of study. So with that, if you have any questions, I'm going to stop the recording, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.